My comments are going to be looking at Chinese concepts of deterrence, because I think it's very important, both in terms of framing the other two presentations this evening, but also because the Chinese have a very, very different concept of deterrence, and that has distinct implications for how we will be interacting with them in the coming months, years, and decades. So, how do the Chinese think about deterrence? Well, let's begin with the fact that they think about it in Chinese. And that's very important because the Chinese term that is translated as deterrence, wei se, has actually a very different meaning than what we would think of when we use the word deterrence. The Western concept of deterrence is focused on dissuasion, right? Schelling, Brody, Mearsheimer, all of these folks, they say specifically in their writings, coercion is not part of deterrence. So Western concepts of deterrence also tend to focus on military methods of achieving the dissuasive effect. Western policymakers often focus on deterring actions in a given domain. So when you hear about, for example, space deterrence, most American Western thinkers are saying deterring enemy action in space. Cyber deterrence, preventing or dissuading an adversary from acting in the cyber domain. Wei se is very different because wei se is about compellence, about making your adversary bow to your will. And that can be dissuasive, because that is a form of compellence. I want to keep you from doing something you want to do. But it can also be coercive. I want you to do something you don't want to do. And so you wind up, when reading Chinese materials and reading the translations, it's often, we will deter Taiwan into acknowledging one country, two systems. And you read that, it's like, wow, that's really bad. I mean, as a translation, not necessarily just as a policy issue. And the problem here is that that's because they are translating the term wei se as deterrence rather than compellence. Another important point here is that deterrence is ultimately about achieving a particular political end. And so the Chinese typically talk about deterring through space or through cyber. There is something I want you to do or something I don't want you to do, and I will use space actions or cyber actions or nuclear actions in order to achieve that larger political end. And that means that in some ways we are already talking past each other. Another part here is that the Chinese concept of wei se explicitly includes three elements. One, actual capabilities, and two, the will to use those capabilities. So far, so good. Every Western writing on deterrence also makes this point. But the Chinese also explicitly make the point that there is a third element, which is communicating both capabilities and will to an adversary. This is explicit, and it also means that various actions that are undertaken are often going to be filtered through a deterrence, or more accurately, compellence aspect. So one of the things to keep in mind here, for example, is multi-domain, multi-aspect deterrence or compellence, whereby the Chinese have to be thinking about, can I use actions in a particular domain, maritime, nuclear, etc., in order to achieve a broader political goal? And how will that be interpreted? How is this going to communicate my interests, my will, to third parties? Because China, unlike the United States and the Soviet Union, has long been focused on multilateral deterrence. We were worried about the Soviets were worried about us, overwhelming nuclear capabilities, tens of thousands of warheads, ability to destroy the world multiple times over. There you go. If you're the Chinese, beginning in 1960, before 1960, you were worried the Americans might nuke you. After 1960, you also have to worry about whether or not the Soviets might nuke you. And they might do it apart from what the Americans were thinking of. After 1974, at least in theory, the Indians now have a nuclear capability. Made it much more explicit after the nuclear tests of the 1990s. And of course, you have the perennial problem of Japan, who, as we all know, actually is just scheming and waiting for an opportunity to restart a war with China. By the way, if you're Koreans, you think that the Japanese are going to do that to you as well. But the point here is the Chinese have to worry about the credibility of their nuclear and other compellence messages based upon not just can I deter one adversary, but multiple adversaries. As a result, Chinese concepts of wei se is also not only through military actions and capabilities. The Chinese think about racking and stacking global capabilities under the rubric comprehensive national power, which, by the way, was originally a Japanese concept and term developed in the late 1980s. Comprehensive national power includes not just military capacity, but economic capacity, political unity, diplomatic reputation and influence, science and technology capacity, cultural security. Each of these elements can be applied as part of a compellence strategy. And so comprehensive national power is the bridge between strategic deterrence and warfighting. It is the ability to deter war, compel an adversary, and constrain conflict. And if deterrence should fail, then CNP, comprehensive national power, provides for potential power to supplement actual power. It provides a diplomatic and political adjuncts to military capacity. And central to People's Liberation Army writings on deterrence is paying attention to the transition between deterrence and open conflict. So wei se ultimately is about perception management. So that's the Chinese concept of deterrence writ large. What about these specifics? So, beginning with nuclear, since Henry was kind enough to invite me here, China has a limited nuclear deterrent. We'll hear a lot more about numbers of warheads and capabilities. China officially adheres to a no first use policy. However, past comments by senior Chinese leaders suggest that this is not an absolute no first use policy. For example, attacks against certain types of targets, including dams or National Command Authority, even with conventional weapons, the Chinese write, may lead to a nuclear response. Chinese writings about deterrence in nuclear, in information, and in space all include an interesting ladder. For those of you who are aficionados of this sort of thing, in some ways it resembles Herman Kahn, but Kahn had 44 rungs, and for the Chinese, typically they have far fewer. So for nuclear deterrence, for example, we have 7 explicitly laid out. Public opinion pressure, including public displays of nuclear weapons, increased weapons readiness, for example, displays of increased launch readiness, demonstration of capabilities, deploying forces in full view of an adversary's satellites when you know they're going to be overhead, manipulating an adversary's calculus of the situation through exercises, testing of C2 links, declarations, test launches of nuclear systems, test impacts near adversary forces and locations, including explicitly aircraft carriers. And then finally, the formal announcement of a lowering of the nuclear threshold. Nuclear deterrence. Space deterrence. Space deterrence, and again, always remember, when we're talking about deterrence, it's wei se, so more accurately, space compellence, has consistently been a vital part of Chinese military thinking since the mid-1990s and has always been part of Chinese writings about space. Space deterrence writings parallel that about nuclear deterrence, including actual use of weapons. So here the deterrence rungs, there are about 4 of them. The first is testing space weapons. Now, one of the interesting things to consider here is that in 2007, China tested a direct ascent ASAT, destroying one of their own weather satellites, one of the worst debris-generating events since the founding of the space age. Interestingly, 50th anniversary at the time. And the American arms control community promptly said, well, they didn't really know what they were doing. It's like, wow, okay, that's kind of interesting. Because if they had known, they wouldn't have done it. Interesting. That was 2007. In 2005, Chinese military textbooks said, you want to test space weapons, in order to effect 威慑, so that your adversaries have to factor in your demonstrated ability to destroy their space capabilities. So what this would seem to suggest is that we should all basically surrender now, because clearly China has developed time travel. And that means, how do you defeat time travel? Hard enough to defeat space capabilities, but if China can go back and rewrite its own textbooks 2 years before they actually do a test, then clearly, usually I get a better reaction on that one. Wow. This is a much more serious crime. My apologies. So, remember your servers, try the veal. So the point here being that the Chinese have been thinking about this long before they actually conducted the 2007 ASAT test, or the subsequent tests against geosynchronous satellites and other capabilities. Next on the rung, exercising space forces. To be fair to the Chinese, we, the United States, have been conducting the Schriever space war games since the late 1990s, and the first several games were very explicit about who the enemy was, the People's Republic of China. And then in at least one case, we said, well, we don't want to name the country anymore, so it's going to be this large Asian country intending to intimidate a small island about 100 miles off their coast. I don't think it was Cuba. So in that regard, the Chinese rightfully probably think that they have been subjected to 威慑 since at least the late 1990s regarding space. Third is reinforcing space capabilities, including moving systems that are already in orbit, as well as deploying new capabilities. And then finally, the actual use of space weapons in, quote, space shock and awe strikes. By the way, the term shock and awe for the Chinese is a term that actually is rooted all the way back from Tang Dynasty poetry. So this is not borrowing American language from the 1990s. This is a Chinese term that simply is best translated as shock and awe. Let me note here that separate from space deterrence, but associated with it is space blockade operations, where the Chinese talk about blockading terrestrial facilities, orbits, launch windows, and then information blockades. Information blockades leads into a third aspect of deterrence in the Chinese mindset, and that is information deterrence. Let me note here, information, not just cyber. Okay? This is a function of the information age. We now live in the information age. In the Chinese view, what that means is, one, the currency of international power is no longer simply a matter of how many tons of bauxite have you smelted, how many gigawatts of energy, how many cargo ships have you produced. Rather, it is as much a matter of how much information you can generate, you can transmit, you can analyze, because otherwise it's just data, and that you can exploit more rapidly and more accurately than your adversaries. So in this context, the Chinese talk about information deterrence, and this includes at the strategic level of political warfare. Think of political warfare as the hardest form of soft power. It is the use of public opinion warfare to shape and mold global public opinion, leaders and the masses. It is psychological warfare, eroding confidence, intimidating, and finally legal warfare. We have some lawyers here. The use of the law, not to argue that your actions are legal, but to achieve political ends. Yeah, that's right. Because it is not simply Chinese law or international law, but also things like the laws of armed conflict, regulatory aspects, and law enforcement agencies. I'm sure most of you have heard about the events in the South China Sea, China's building of new islands. One of the interesting things to consider here is that the Chinese use the Chinese Coast Guard to send the message, hey, these islands, they're ours. Okay. So part of this is simple political messaging. China is using civilian law enforcement, nice peaceful Coast Guard ships. The Americans send Navy vessels. It's almost like a George Carlin routine. But something in addition that is part of the political messaging, which is that China uses law enforcement entities because it is Chinese territory. And therefore, China no more has to use its military than we would think about dropping a brigade of the 82nd on the south side of Chicago because of extensive criminal issues. Chinese information deterrence operations then broadly speaking, include network space technology experiments, which they assume will be detected, network space equipment displays, operational exercises, and then operational activities. So these are the three perhaps most important, but let me just note very quickly, the Chinese also discuss mobilization deterrence, the idea that they would mobilize their forces visibly, mobilize their economy visibly, and that too would have a compellence effect. And finally, economic deterrence, economic compellence. And we saw this, for example, towards the South Koreans over THAAD through weaponized tourism. So I notice Henry's standing up, so I'm going to assume that I'm about to get the hook, and thank you all very much.